So once again, we are here with another session, uh, an interesting talk again by Dr. Pinky Isha, the Assistant Professor of English from Rabindra Bharati University. So today he is going to talk on an interview of Black American literature, and again another session we have from 5 p.m. that is on the role of media and technical communication in business and overview. So right now she will be talking on an overview of Black American literature. So without further ado, I like to request P to start her deliberation. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Tonmai. Today, my topic of discussion, it's a very broad topic, an overview of African American literature. Before I gave this topic, I wasn't sure as to what I'm going to speak on. So I was thinking of speaking on particular texts for that matter, but then I decided that most of our students, Indian students everywhere in academia, they have a very sketchy idea about the background of any genre or the background of any particular literature. So that needs to be done first before we go on to the individual texts. And so today, what I've been trying to do is, or what I would rather, this is purely an extempo speech. So I would just like to discuss why we have that peculiar term African American literature. And we have such terms as Asian American literature, we have such terms as Chicano American literature, we have such terms as Native American literature. And so once again here there is this binary African American literature. It speaks for itself. Now before any discussion, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear
Yes,
me?
you're audible. You're audible.
Okay, thank you. So I go on. Yeah, so even before a discussion on any African American literature, we all know that African Americans, in fact, Africans, today the African American, the terminology that we use for uh, this category actually has to be studied in relation to the fact that from the 16th to the 19th centuries, there had been around 12 million Africans who were brought into the Americas. And these Africans, the very fact that they were brought into the Americas was for the purpose of slavery. And so this displacement, this kind of abduction, this great shift or forced migration, oppression, then once again, should we say genocide, segregation, slavery, all these things, and of course racism that comes in inevitably, gives us that particular trait in that combination, in that compound word African American, which has to be understood in great detail, and which we come to even in contemporary times. So that is a history, that's a legacy of slavery, and it's a sad history which we cannot do away with at any cost. Starting from there, because it began with slavery, the influx of Africans into the Americas, because it began with slavery, it began with repression, it began with oppression, and it began with killing and destruction and mayhem. So we see how kind of, you see, the first recorded examples of American literature by the African Americans themselves were actually slave narratives, fictionalized autobiographies. And they were also those narratives which some African Americans have written with great, acclaim, because they were educated in the English language. For example, after coming maybe. For example, we have Britain Hammond, the narrative of uncommon suffering and surprising deliverance by Britain Hammond, a Negro man. This narrative itself is a unique narrative, as much as we have the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vassa, uh, the African by himself, which was written by Olaudah Equiano and published in 1789. He writes about how he was taken, abducted from Africa and brought to Americas, and how a painful life followed, and how he was ultimately resurrected or maybe rescued from slavery. We have the very beautiful example of the first slave poetry by Phyllis Wheatley. She was taken from a synagogue at the age of 8, and she came to the Wheatley family. And this was a family that recognized her talent for learning. And what they did is they allowed her to learn English. They allowed her to read English textbooks. And within just 16 months, you see, Wheatley had managed to master the English language, and her importance is due to the fact that she started writing occasional poems. She started writing verse, which kind of was inspired by events within the Wheatley family, particular events, ritualized events in the family, etc. And so that was the first example of a woman, African American woman writing. We have the example of Terry Prince, Lucy Terry Prince, and how she was also a slave who was brought to Rhode Island, and her husband secured her release just before her marriage, and she wrote Bar's Fight, another ballad poem. So these are examples and many more. Perhaps we can even think of Jupiter Hammond, who is regarded as the founder of African American literature, because in that point of time, in the early 18th century, people were, wanting to end slavery. They were writing tracts, and they were wanting to explore the idiom of the masters and criticizing slavery by being within the institution itself. And Jupiter Hammond did it from the evangelist point of view after he had accepted Christianity. Not all of them were slaves, but yes, they were definitely from slave parents, their lineage. We can think of Benjamin Banneker, who was, a free man, but who collaborated with a black man, but he collaborated with Jefferson on various racial issues. He wrote about the Negroes' right to freedom. He wrote about the racial politics in the Americas. And he was an inventor, he was a writer, he was also a mathematician. So we have several other examples, like, say, for example, we can think of William Wells Brown. We can think of, well, John Marrant, for example. John Marrant, he was, a Negro who, while he was passing from the church, passing by a church service from outside, he was inducted into Christianity. He left his family. He was thought to be insane. He later embraced Christianity and dispelled some of the myths which said that African Americans had an inborn streak of paganism in them, and this paganism could only be countered by acceptance of Christianity. So we have various facets of these slave writings, not only from the point of the fact that they were exploited, they were kind of well oppressed, but yes, we also see their unique sensibility coming out from their works, from their written fictionalized biographies, autobiographies, reflections, etc. Now, in more contemporary times, when we come to a reading of African American literature, we can think now, it would seem that I'm giving you a list of names, but I think that is, in a way, important because, as I said when I began, that there are a few books which we always have to read, and we would do good to read them as major areas where we can see how a literature progresses, how a literature evolves through decades. We can think of Washington's Up from Slavery in 1901. And just immediately a year after that, we have the very famous text of W.E.B. Du Bois, 1903, The Souls of Black Folks. And here, Boaz is trying to argue about the fact that how the Negro gets appropriated. How the Negro gets appropriated in the sense that how he loses his identity to the white mindset, how he tries to frame his behavior, tries to frame his lifestyle, tries to frame his entire orientation from the way he would be viewed. So it is a loss of identity on a double stand. First, you lose your identity because by the sheer virtue of your color, the color line, the color difference. And secondly, you lose your identity because you are not supposed to act as a Negro. You're supposed to behave according to the stereotyping of white men, so that stereotyping of white men in order to impress the white society, or in order to get a place in the white society. Ironically, they never do get a place, but this kind of a change, a makeover, a shift is what Dubois calls a double consciousness, quote unquote. And I would like to repeat that word, double consciousness, because a Negro is never his own self, as Dubois says in The Souls of Black Folk, where he postulates that, well, a Negro is always in an intermediary phase as to how he should be in a different country that does not call him its own, and how he would like to be in that country where, if he would really have been able to, he would have been able to be like what genetically, or what morally, or what psychologically, or culturally a Negro ought to be. So that's a very important book. There are other important books in the 20th century, like Zora Neale Hurston, and these are novels which are important because they reveal that essential mindset, the binaries which the African American faced in the first generation, as first generation, second generation, third generation immigrants, or maybe, well, people who had come from a legacy of slavery. The very famous text, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And you see, there were a few writers like James Baldwin. We have writers like, for example, very famous text, if you go from the viewpoint of the text, Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, 1952, and Richard Wright's The Native Son, 1940. And James Baldwin's novels, most of them are exceptional and brilliant. And with particular reference, I mean, I wouldn't be going into an analysis of the novels as such, but uh, I would just like to mention a few names. If B.L. Street Could Talk, Giovanni's Room, another novel by Baldwin, and Another Country, and Go Tell It on the Mountain. Now, Baldwin was vying for African American rights. Baldwin was talking about how, uh, you know, the white people have kind of discriminated the Negro, and he wanted to dispel the myths of sexuality. He wanted to dispel the myths of paganism, which had plagued, and the myths of illiteracy, uh, the myths of, a barbarous civilization, which had been the main areas by which, or the main postulates by which to demean the Black existence, the Black identity. And he addressed issues of Black, sexuality. He talked about gay rights. He talked about masculinity in the African American paradigm. And he was also he was not very happy with by going, though he at one point of time from his novels you would feel there's this slight hint of militancy in what he which come out from the themes of his novels, but he's also not very eagerly going to well, campaign for Black nationalism. What he feels is missing from the African American experience was the fact that African Americans needed to be integrated. That integrationalism was something that was missing, whether it was in modern America in the early 20th century or late 20th century. And this integrationalism was something that was to be done by a kind of the multicultural environment which prevailed. The African American was supposed to integrate himself by ways that were not only African, but by imbibing ways that were American as well. And he also said that there is a wider rubric of theory, and this theory, how would it, affect the African American experience? Could it really come to terms with the African American experience? What about literary theory? The major theories like post-structuralism, like, for example, psychoanalysis, the theories of Marxism, the theories of feminism, how would they fit inside, or how would the African American experience fit into the mold of these theories? Was it at all possible? And he was also trying to see how the African Americans could really have a social and cultural emancipation, and that was very important. He has a series of very valuable essays. I just mentioned one, which is The Fire Next Time, and which deals with very minute issues of African American consciousness that is at work by any writer writing for their own people. Uh, Apart from Baldwin, we see that writings, even when they are fiction or novels, writings could be, commonly spreading across the idea of, ethnicity versus nationhood. Now, this is a term which is relatively tackled after the 50s, because before the 50s, it was always the race at the intersection of gender while talking about African American experience. But later on, from the 60s and 70s, it was also ethnicity versus nationalism, and how did the African Americans manage to, put forth themselves at the intersection of ethnicity and nationalism? How were they supposed to behave, and how was the nation supposed to look upon them as people who were not people from Africa, but actually had been natives of, actually through their generational uh, continuity, had been, people of America? How was this possible? Among the women, we see that there was a burgeoning of women's consciousness and women's writings from the 50s, 60s, and very many works dealing with African American women have been on the forefront and have been very, very acclaimed. We have some few very brilliant writers like Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, 1970, and in that same year, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison, in her most recent novel, Love, says how going back to African roots through song, through folklore, can be a therapy. So, African experience, the kind of African lineage, can actually be therapeutic, and how Africans, even in modern America, they need to explore this. If we see other novels that deal with slavery, if we see novels that deal with motherhood, we have such, and of course, going back to trace one's roots, we have such brilliant novels as Song of Solomon. And we have Song of Solomon, and we have jazz in the 90s. And yes, we have other concerns in writings by African American women. Two major concerns are slavery and motherhood at the intersection of family and poverty. Uh, you see, family violence is something that is predictably there in every novel by more or less either as a passive force or as an active portrayal in many novels by African American women under the irresponsibility of the male folk. Uh, how at the juncture of the family uh, being stabilized, it's only the woman who acts as an agent to maintain her family, how the men are practically always absent. Either they're absent financially or they're absent in sustaining the moral values. And we also have a neat analysis of father-daughter relationships and male-to-male relationships. But male-to-male relationships in the novels by women have not received as much prominence as we have the predominance of female-to-female relationships, like mother-daughter relationships and relationships in the larger community, in the neighborhood, in society by women, in through the women's writings. For example, there is a peculiar feature that we notice, how the mothers behave with their daughters. Now, the mothers who have evolved from a history of slavery, they have become so hardened that they've become so hardened and immune to that kind of setup where they are supposed to be repressed, raped, oppressed, their wishes and their desires and their lives and their bodies have always been controlled. That what moral values do they pass on to their daughters? We see that they hardly have anything to pass on. What they pass on is a legacy of violence, that violence which they have faced all along through their lives. They can't give anything else to their daughters. So when the daughters are growing up in that adolescent phase, what they see their mothers doing is they cannot imagine a human being with any humane values which the mother represents. So that is another topic which is very brilliantly handled by Morrison, and she does it in most of her novels. Is with other women's novels. There is also a corollary to this aspect. There is this idea of women bonding, and we have a lot of women bonding in various novels where women are being are trying to form some kind of trying to form an association with each other, trying to form a common a common nexus where they can talk about each other's lives, because that's mostly the same. And we have brilliant novels by Alice Walker, her very famous Color Purple. And we have another, I don't think many have read it, but it is an important novel, and it is titled The Third Life of Grange Copeland. We have Possessing the Spirit of Joy by Alice Walker again, just as we have The Third Life of Copeland and Grange Copeland. And you see the kind of themes that are handled. One of the themes is the father-daughter relationship ending in rape and female mutilation, which was a fact among the Africans, the Nigerians mostly, and how those these racial qualities and practices and rituals and beliefs, they permeate even people in contemporary times. And uh, Morrison had always initially started with the question of female identity. Uh, are females accorded any identity at all? Are females, do they or can they claim identity and respect in the wider African American society? Now there is this othering. There is this quote unquote othering of the African American women, and this othering is twice. Why I say that this othering is twice is because they are the other in their own house. They are being repressed, suppressed, they're being tortured, rather butchered by their male folk who come home drinking, who come home to demand money. They take charge over the women's bodies, they rape them if required. If they don't have money, they go away. And then these women, somehow, when they gather themselves up to present a calm face outside, they are othered by those at the workplace, whether it be a domestic household or whether it be the confines of an office. So this double othering, which is there in Morrison, in Walker, in many other writers, women writers, has also been shown by James Baldwin. James Baldwin also talks about the othering of the Africans in America, even after becoming citizens. So there are some common intersection points between the women's writings and the male writings, which kind of fuse and then they bifurcate from there, and then they again kind of converge. We can think of writings by Gloria Hull, and the name is very nice. I mean, the name is speaks for itself. We have a writing by Gloria Hull which is called All the Men Are White, and another writing by her which is titled All the Women are sorry I'm sorry All the Men Are Black and All the Women Are White, but some of us are brave. Now, All the Women Are White, but some of us are brave is a title that, as I said, speaks for itself, because how can all the women be white? They have imbibed the white mindset, and as we have seen in the novel The Bluest Eye by Morrison, how this little child, she has imbibed the white concepts of beauty. She has imbibed the white stereotyping of usefulness or importance or elegance, or the white idea of compatibility, so much so that at one point of time she goes mad. It is not only the rape that leaves her broken and, totally to pieces, but it's also the idea that she believes herself to be incompatible with that ideology, that white ideology, that concept of beauty and existence that needed to be beautiful in the by the white standards. So you see this these themes go on reiterating. And we have other important works like this time by Gloria Naylor's The Woman of Brewster Place, and Audre Lorde Zami, or Paula Marshall's Brown Girl, Brownstones, or another very important work, Praise Song of the Widow. We have new writers like Shirley Ann Williams, Disa Rose, once again talking about the African American experience, going back to the past, to folklore. We have Terry Macmillan's Waiting to Exhale. So all these texts, in one way or the other, they kind of address the individual and collective consciousness of African American women in America. So the specialty of these books is that though they are individualized narratives, but they also bring in the collective consciousness of a community together. And not only women, you see men, of course. If we are talking about women fraternity, well, there have been writers who are again and again harping on the same kind of male experience, the experience of being a black male in America, and how it, the legacy of difference, the legacy of, distancing continues. Yes, distancing is the proper word, I guess. Distancing from, the mainstream, and this is automatic. This is, a kind of thing that has been predetermined, and it has been, manipulated, and there cannot be any replacement for it, any better replacement, maybe worse replacements, but never better. And we can think of John Edgar Wideman's The Homewood Trilogy and Philadelphia Fire in 1990, another very brilliant text, The Philadelphia Fire. And we can also think about Charles Johnson's, the very famous text, The Middle Passage, and The Ox Herding Tale. I repeat, The Middle Passage by Charles Johnson, and Charles Johnson's The Ox Herding Tale, both written sometime in the 80s and 90s. So just as women, men were trying to pen down their experiences about being a Black American in America. Now, I don't think I would have enough time to cover the Harlem Renaissance, but I would like to speak a little about theory. I was talking about African American writings by men and women, African American literature as such. But where is the place or position of theory, or how well does African American literature reciprocate the theoretical paradigms that we have in mainstream white European elitist mainstream canonical societies? How do they carry forth or negotiate spaces between the literary and the theoretical standpoints? And here I would like to mention that apart from very brilliant white critical theorists, well, Elaine Locke, Baldwin, Richard Wright, uh, yeah, these have been the people in the forefront of theory, uh, who actually wrote fiction which could be a reflection of what theory could be. But there is a persistent question in academia, which is that is African American literature supposed to crawl under the rubric of an already existing, heavily interpolated canonical theory? Or are African American writers supposed to come out with their own theories? Are they supposed to, bring about certain, theoretical constructs from arising out from their own works or peculiar to their own works? And this is a very important thing. And keeping this in mind, we can think about Henry Louis Gates, and we can think about Houston Baker. Now, they started a journal which was called the Black American Literature Journal. And Houston Baker, he was talking about, and why I said I would not be going, I just take a small break, why I said I wouldn't be going to the Harlem Renaissance so much, but then we move back and forth with the Harlem Renaissance every time, the period of the 1920s, because we have it coming and going in the consciousness of other Black African American writers. And because I mentioned the Harlem Renaissance, I would also like to say that Houston Baker says that how, in one of his seminal texts, which is titled Modernism and the Harlem Renaissance, he talks about the Negro, and how the Negro sustains, revives, kind of reinvents himself, and also rediscovers himself, regenerates himself, rediscovers, gives himself a rebirth through jazz, through the blues music. Because any jazz, any blues, any hip hop, any rap music, the spirituals, the gospels were actually not simply a musical genre. They have the capacity to sustain the Negro world, the Negro philosophical paradigm, and through this, the Negro would feel himself at ease with his own society, his own people, and peace with himself. And does the wider movement of modernism take into account this Harlem Renaissance? How is a very pertinent question that Houston Baker asks is, what is the contribution of the Harlem Renaissance to modernism as a worldwide, discipline, a theoretical, discipline? And he tries to prove that uh, before the African American music evolved through the blues and through well, the blues and the rap and the hip hop, there was this very standardized, white, canonical, white music, which had a classical base, and this white music, which had a classical base, was actually always, practiced in operas, or maybe, in specific concerts meant for mainstream white audiences. But Houston Baker is saying that everything in Britain underwent a complete change from the time the blues and the rap and the Negro spirituals and the gospel music entered the world of music, and how music was totally transformed, and uh, the musical scenario was reborn, it was reinvented, and practically there is no music in the world today, there is no music in the whole of Americas which has not been influenced by jazz. And the demarcating line between black and white has been totally obfuscated. It has been totally obfuscated with the arrival of jazz and the blues. So, if the jazz and the blues could transform the musical scenario, it could transform the world of music completely, then modernism had received a great impetus, definitely, from the Harlem Renaissance. And this is a very important thing that he propounds. He also talks about, in his very important text, vernacular theory. He's talking about how the Africans have a particular vernacular language. That language has its own flavors. And through this, the nitties of the language, through the speech idioms of the language, even when an African American is speaking in English, even through the speech idioms, we kind of get to understand the world of the Negro. So it is not always the standard British or the standard English that an African American ought to speak. There can be Creole variations, there can be other variations of speech rhythms, there can be repetitions, which is peculiarly important for the Negro when he's speaking, because that brings in his own racial consciousness, and that comes in inevitably without any conscious determinism that I have to use this kind of a language in a work. So all these are features which Houston Baker is talking about in vernacular theory. And there's another very important critical work, because now from the I'm talking about critical works and not really novels or dramas. And there is another work by Houston Baker which is titled Blues Ideology and African American Literature. Now, how the blues have totally changed the ideology of the white mainstream society, white Americans, so to say, and how it has influenced and it has sustained and it has helped the flowering of multiculturalism in America. About multiculturalism, you see, James Baldwin gives a wider berth, but Houston Baker also talks about multiculturalism from this angle, how the blues has influenced and changed ideologies. When we come to, from Houston Baker, when we come to, uh, well, Gates, we see Henry Louis Gates he wrote two texts. One was uh, Figures in Black, and the other was The Signifying Monkey, a theory of African American literary criticism. Now, The Signifying Monkey, theory of African American literary criticism, is a theoretical exposition of the fact that language in African culture does have many variants, and how potently important and how uh, how emergent and how very pressing issues are addressed through this use of language. Language calls forth associations which are signifiers. You see, so linguistic signifiers can be racial signifiers, can be signifiers for an entire community, and these signifiers are very valuable, and they're not measurable by the Western standards of other linguists who have written about signifiers in structural theory, post-structural theory. So these are a different set of signifiers, but Henry Louis Gates's works have been criticized by a few other Black Americans and even white Americans who believe that he had somehow skipped, that element of militancy which is there in Black language, as is there in Black culture. Not to speak of militancy in a bad sense, which also Baldwin uses, because James Baldwin is talking about Black militancy and how that Black militancy exercised itself through 3 centuries. Yeah, and how this militancy continues in literary tropes, in literary motives, in by the Blacks themselves, but by the whites. All right. So yes, Gates' works has been, critical writings have been criticized from also the viewpoint of the fact that he was talking about pluralities, but he didn't address the homogeneity that also existed beside pluralities. And so this homogeneity is something which is important, because you see, when we are talking about integration, you see, we kind of negotiate points, common points, and then we kind of integrate ourselves. So yes, there can be pluralities, but how these pluralities are merged in that wider homogeneous category of being an American. But the binary remains African American, which I began by saying when I started my lecture, that we have so many nomenclatures: Asian Americans, Chicano Americans, Native Americans, Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, etc., etc. Uh, there also have been some direction in critical writings about women, African American women. By We can think about work like Towards a Black Feminist Criticism by Barbara Smith, where, like Baldwin, Barbara Smith is talking about women's language and women's eye for details. Now, African American women have a different way of perceiving. One should have an identifiable, knowledge about women's literature. One should have an identifiable knowledge about the continuity of the women tradition in African societies before they interpret the wider nuances of African American writing, women writings. And she's also in this particular towards a black feminist, towards a black, yes, towards a black feminist, towards an African American. That title it's somehow got muddled up in my head, but you see, Barbara Smith is also talking about uh, a very interesting thing which I find in her is that she talks about uh, you see how white well, standards of judgment do not apply to black women, whether they are in America or whether they are anywhere else. And why white standards of judgment do not apply to women is because she was trying to address the homophobia which is there in literary reception towards black women's writings, whether that is a black woman living inside America or whether that is a black woman somewhere else in the world or from some other continent. You see, so there is this, addressing of this kind of a differentiation, and that's very interesting. Towards the black feminist criticism addresses all those points very succinctly. Uh, we can think of more recent literary criticism, and one that is very interesting in with regard to women, African American women, that is Hazel Carby's Reconstructing Womanhood, the emergence of African American novelists. Now, here she's talking about, and the title is significant, it is reconstructing. So they have formed themselves anew as if they have tried to reconstruct their identities as such through being a woman, through the process of being a woman. And this work anticipates one of the major mainstream writings written by, cultural theorists like, say, for example, Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, or we can think of Kobana Mercer's Welcome to the Jungle in 1994. And of course, goes without saying, Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. You see, all these works, uh, whether they are critical works, and I've been very sparing in my discussion of critical theory. I've just mentioned a few names like Henry Louis Gates, and I've talked about Houston Baker, and I've been trying to talk about Baldwin, and I've been trying to talk about uh, a little about Barbara Smith, with a few more names like Carby and Paul Gilroy, which students I think they must be doing at their PG level. And they might want to perhaps read Welcome to the Jungle, which is a recent text in 1994. These texts, these critical texts, they do address, you see, the male and the female perspectives, literary perspectives, racial perspectives, nationalism, multiculturalism, and how globalized societies they build themselves up through the decades, and that is very important. Now, when we go back to, we cannot say that a phase completely finishes or that is something of the past, at least in African American experience, because if you think of the Harlem poems by Langston Hughes, A Dream Deferred, and other poems, how brilliantly they mirror the Negro experience, and it stands valid even today. I would just like to read two lines from that poem, which is titled "A Dream Deferred." The last three lines. See, that dream of being equal, the dream of having to get a different mileage when one moves to a new setting, a new country, has always been deferred. And so the last three lines of this poem, I just read out. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Now, this explode, this word explode is important because what is exploding? In fact, a lot has been said about African American sensibility, which has not been recognized, and that sensibility, identity, those voices, the suppression has exploded or will be exploding. And I would like to wind up my lecture with a few more interesting, reflections from critics. But before I do that, I would, because this is a topic which is very broad, and I'm sorry because I have not been covering, I would have loved to cover a little bit of the poetry. I would have loved to cover a little bit of the Harlem Renaissance and go back and forth with other texts. But as I said, I was just wanting to give you a general overview. I When I'm talking about overview of African American writing, I would just like to hint on another term, which is Afrocentrism. Afrocentrism and Afrocentrism, yes, and Afrocentricity. Okay, the term which was used by Molefi Keith Asante, he says that what is Afrocentricity? Afrocentrism, by its definition, is something where a black man has to have a very good idea about his own identity, and this identity is not a created identity. It is already there, irrespective of nationality, irrespective of ethnicity. It is the Negro's own identity, the primal identity. Maybe it's like, an archetypal identity, which is not always a cultural identity. It is historical and it is also cultural. So the merging of history and culture together is what Asante is trying to do. And he says that Africans in America have always been made to believe that drama and poetry and other forms of literary expression had come from the Greeks. Performance practices had come from the European white uh, countries, European white civilizations, and that Christianity was the only benevolent civilized religion. But Asante tries to prove that long before Homer existed and long before the Greeks existed, there was the civilization of the Nile River Valley, and how the Egyptians, how black civilizations had been very, very advanced. And that Negro lineage, that Negro history, that history of an entire civilization 3,000 years back has not been taught to people of the African descent, people of black origins. And little children in schools have been trained in the white mindset. They have not been trained to appreciate their own culture because no knowledge about their own culture was available in schools, in academia to begin with. And when these nurturing minds did not receive any idea of black contribution, they were led to believe that they had no contribution at all to world civilizations, and which was extremely, extremely wrong. And so Molefi Asante, you see, talks about training African children, talks about imbibing Africans with that idea of their own lineage, of their own ancient civilizations, of their own legacies, which have been brilliant, in fact, one of the oldest ones in the history of human civilizations. And over here, I would like to. There's a quote which I have used for a reason because I believe that this quote is very helpful in understanding what happens when you suppress an entire nation, an entire race of people, and they learn to accept themselves as slaves, as secondary people, as people having secondary identities, as people having no identities. And over here, there is a very exceptional work. I will just read a quote from that. In 1933, it is titled The Miseducation of the Negro. It is a book which was originally published in 1933 by Carter G. Woodson. And I'm quoting from there, uh, begin quote. When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for his special benefit. His education makes it necessary. Unquote. So you see, education is the first judging point as to from where to start with. So that education, that consciousness of being, existing long before you're even recognized, has to be imbibed. And that is one of the prime contentions of Afrocentricity and that work, Afrocentrism, somewhere in the 80s, written in the published in the 80s, is very, very important, because over here Molefe gives an idea of the educational changes that Negro children in the Americas should have, and there should be a special educational paradigm for them so that they can trace their roots. And I will end by pointing at two other very essential quotes, because I think that they are very important. As you know, the Black Arts movement was very important because the Black Arts were trying to, I'll just mention a term with this regard. The Black Arts movement were the main point, main vantage point of the movement was that whether it was in the field of art or whether it was in the field of writing, it should be functional for the Black people, for the Black nation, for the Black heritage, for the Black consciousness, and which they defined as, quote unquote, functional art or functional writing. And this is almost like the jazz and the blues, though it's a different genre, it's a genre of music. But you see, functional art and functional writing. And over here, I have a quote by Amiri Baraka, who says, begin quotes, Black arts is the aesthetic and spiritual sister of the Black power concept. Thus, it envisions an art that speaks directly to the needs and aspirations of Black America. In order to perform this task, the Black arts movement proposes a radical reordering of Western cultural aesthetics. It proposes a separate symbolism, mythology, critique, and iconology. Close quotes. Now, this is very, very important, and the proposal of, as you see, a different set of symbolisms, a different set of mythology, critique, and iconology, and iconography as well that comes out, how to associate that needs to be. It's a wonderful quotation of 4 lines, which actually helps us to understand that how African Americans would actually, help themselves and help other people of their uh, of their country and climb to understand the basic concepts of Afrocentricity. And this is Afrocentricity in a much more broader light. And I would also end by with the last quotation by Larry Neal, and he was also a theoretician of the Black arts movement, because I've tried in my own, peculiar way to just give you a few, you know, snippets of Black, African American critical works. And so I would, because I'm not being able to go into detail for the paucity of time, but I would give you a small quotation from Larry Neal. Larry Neal, another theoretician of the Black arts movement, states that Black aesthetics is broader than an African American cultural tradition. Now, what do we mean by African American cultural tradition? When we are thinking of African American cultural tradition, that is a merging of African American traditions. But here we are talking of Black aesthetics. Black aesthetics means without, the idea of America coming in, maybe Blacks before they came to America. And what is that? What is that aesthetics? And he explains with this quote, with this wonderful quote, I quote, encompasses all unusable elements of third world culture. The motive behind the Black aesthetics is the destruction of the white thing, the destruction of white ideas and white ways of looking at the world. Unquote. Now, destruction is a harsher word, I believe, but destruction not in the sense of doing away with, destruction in the sense of something becoming overbearing, something superseding the Black consciousness. So destruction in that sense, not destruction by doing away completely. So the black arts or the black aesthetics or the Afrocentricity, which needs to be imbibed or cultivated, has to be done with regard to black consciousness, with regard to black standards of judgment, with regard to black cultural and anthropological domains, and it has to be rooted in African cultures. So, with this, I conclude my discussion on African American writing or literature, to be specific. Thank you so much for your patience here.
Yes, the uh, so, so shall we take questions right now?
Yeah,
The
yeah, yeah, sure, sure. Yes, that's an important question, Mr. Odhikari. Yes, it's a double ordering for the migrant situation right now in this COVID crisis because the migrants are doubly othered. Yes, of course, because they're othered by their, by the superior society, and they're othered uh, by, as carriers of the virus. Of course, yes, yes, of course. The othering which was there has taken a new manifestation with this pandemic, I would say. Yes, Saurav, yeah, I recognize you. I'm so happy to have this question. Yes, of course, in Gail Jones's Corregidora, I would have mentioned this novel. Of course, you see, there is a third space. There is a third space, and well, I was going to talk about oral cultures because you see, orality had always been intrinsic to the Black experience. Orality had always been intrinsic to Black lives because you see, if you go way back, you see, many of the slave narratives, the slave songs in the Americas, in the Caribbean islands were oral, and even in the novels of Toni Morrison, we have a lot of oral and narrative surfacing, oral stories, oral folklore, oral sayings, proverbs, children's songs, work games, and women's prose, etc. So I think the oral dimension of the African American conscience stays alive even in novels without, you see, any way of contradiction, so to say. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Tonmoy, are we done with the questions or are there other questions?
as we
Yeah,
don't
I
have
think I have answered this one.
no more questions for this session, so we can uh, quickly move to our next session. So, the you like to have a break for 5 minutes? Then we will start the session.
Yeah, I would, sure, sure, sure. I would just like to have one 5 minutes break.
Okay,
That would be
okay,
really great for me.
okay, okay, okay.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I'll be back in just 5 more minutes.
Okay. In this session, our esteemed resource person, Dr. Pinky Isha from Rabindra Bharati University, she will be talking on the role of media and the technical communication in business and overview. We can start our session, Di. So over to you, Di.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Tonmoy, Coach. I would now like to speak about uh, the topic of technical communication and media as it is used in business. Now, yes, I go right on to it. You see, there are three different paths to this lecture. I mean, as much as my intelligence promotes me to understand, and that is number one is technical communication. Number two is media, and the third one is business. So you see, these three terms, when we utilize them, we can make any number of permutations. We can say business communication. We can have something like technical communication, technical competence, technical, you see, marketing strategies. Or we can have something like a very common term, which we as individuals living in today's world have very well understood, the social media. And we cannot live possibly without the help of social media. So I would be trying to explain all these things in as much as time and resource permits me. I would begin by a few terms which are related to techniques, so called, if not fully technical communication, because you see, what are the standard ways in which we communicate electronically? Yes, electronic communication with the help of computers. It goes without saying that for the last 6 to 7 decades, the computers have been very on, and we have this worldwide web technology. This World Wide Web technology uh, got a boost somewhere around the end of the, from the decade of the 70s, 1970s. And in today's world, the World Wide Web technology has, improved by leaps and bounds. Today, we are in World Wide Web technology 2.0, which means it is the second generation of world web computing, and it's the second generation of world web technologies. And I would talk about a few terms which are not actually very useful to you, but I think you must know them. Because see, all of us, we have our mail IDs and we have our mail networks and all. And I think these are the very basics as to what I'm going to speak on before I go on to how social media and how communication actually takes place. Now, there is something called secure socket layer, SSL. Now, secure socket layer, a hardware engineer or any hardware person would easily tell you. This is a socket layer which is called SSL, which means that you can have your own website. Like when we type something, or when you type something over the Google, you will see that the first thing that comes in that address bar is HTTP, and there are two dots, that is the colon mark. Now, what is the meaning of this HTTP? This HTTP, and often it is HTTPS slash two slash and then a colon. Now, this HTTPS is actually a secure socket layer, which means, and why do we have the word secure? Which actually means that this kind of bar address, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello,
Di.
can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. So this kind of, even before the web address is typed out, which means that it would be the address that you type out after the HTTPS would actually be unencrypted once it has gone to the desired recipients. This is to make it a secure site. And in fact, if you want to form a website, and if it does have that HTTPS, you would be able to form a website, or you would be able to enter a webmail service, etc. So that's the basic. Now we have also something called SMPT or SMTP. It is more or less synonymous. Simple Mail Transfer Protocol or Simple Mail Protocol Transfer. It is either SMPT or it is either SMTP. Now, the simple mail protocol transfer is nothing other than you giving mails to various people, and how secure your mail address is, and how securely would it be uncoded by the person you are giving it to. Now, these are applications which we have to know when we are talking about, or when we are, working with a software. We have something called POP, P-O-P. It is Post Office Protocol. Now, what is a Post Office Protocol? Now, when you are sitting in your office, say if this is the room in which I'm sitting is an office space. In the olden days, we had messages over phone. People used to leave messages over phone. And if there were 50 messages over your phone, you would not be able to access them from somewhere else except this room where I'm sitting, because this is my office. And only that telephone has those messages. Now, post office protocol is nothing other than, messages over your, web mail, which will be there at a particular machine, at a particular IP address. You can download it from the main server. You can download it from the SSL, and it will be there in your particular machine as long as you don't delete it. Maybe it will not be there in any other machine, in any other computer or desktop. Now, the modern version of POP, which has been upgraded, the Post Office Protocol, POP, is POP3. In this POP3, you can have it at various other places. If you are a person on the move, think of it as a simple phone recording device, the recording device in your own, say, landline number that stays as long as you don't delete it, and that stays specific to your phone. But POP3 gives you the ability to enter into your own web server at that point of time and access it from anywhere. So it's a bit, improved version of the original POP, which we had way back in the 1970s. I will also talk about IMAP. Okay, now I think these are very technical terms, but I think these need to be just said, if not just once. It is Internet Message Access Protocol, and POP and IMAP, that is Internet Message Access Protocol, are the most common forms of accessing emails. And why am I talking about emails? I'm also coming to that later on as to why am I talking about emails. I'll come back to this again. Now, this Internet Message Access Protocol is something like, you can access any web server from anywhere you like. You can access as many mails as you like, and they will remain in the server unless and until you delete it. And not only can you access it, you can also send it, share it, and maybe get a greater access to web mails. Now, there is some kind of a loss of privacy that we have with IMAP. And since they are the most common, we often hear about things like, so and so has hacked my mail account has got hacked, you don't pick up an online call. In this COVID situation also, we come across such warnings and messages where we are asked that don't press any button, don't give your mail ID because that will be hacked, etc., etc. So you see these nitty-gritties, these hardware and software components involved in the processing and in the wider accessibility of computer networking and computer communication like email, etc. do have a great functional benefit, do have great functional benefits, but at the same time they're also liable to be, there are also, gray patches which can be, manipulated, moved, and then cyber crimes do take place. So that was a little about how web technologies, very little about and very basic about how web technologies and web communication takes place. And I'll come to the idea of communication with the help of a few slides. But before that, before I come to the term communication, and I teach students, and we all have to, teachers of English do have to take communication classes because the CBCS has that in the syllabus, technical communication, creative writing, etc. So before I go on to communication, I will talk about a few. I might want to ask you a few questions. I mean, this is not a question. I would be replying them myself. But uh, is all social media electronic? Or is there any difference between social media and electronic communication? Is what uh, is a question that often kind of surfaces. We can say that all social media is electronic communication, but not all electronic communication is social media. Now, what is social media? Social media, the sites. In fact, students and children of our generation, much more than I am, because I'm already in the previous generation. So, students and young generation teenagers are more into social media. We have so many of them. I'll give you a few names, like you already know: Twitter, Flickr, uh, Quaker, WordPress, LinkedIn, maybe FB, YouTube, and of course we have Delicious. We have things like Instagram. We have things, yes. So, and many more. Perhaps I may have missed out quite a few. So these are the social media sites that we visit. Now, social media is not only for entertainment, it is for a functional purpose. It is for the purpose of marketing. It is for the purpose of communicating with stakeholders. It is for the purpose of making customers worldwide. It is for the purpose of advertising. It is for the purpose of traffic control. It is for the purpose of crime resolutions. And it is for the purpose of CIB and CBI inquiries. Okay, yes, it is for high level emergency inquiries related to business, related to national security. So there is so much of social media that we can literally have social media at your fingertips. And most of the social media, which is electronically manipulated and handled electronically, can actually provide us, make us into groups and little pockets, and we can connect, because we can have many innumerable kind of usages of this social media, without which we are practically handicapped in our present existence. So social media is definitely electronic, but not all electronic media like the email is social media, because email is one to one, it is personal. Okay. Twitter accounts and Twitter groups, of course, can be, they're always electronic, but they're not social media, because if there is a particular Twitter group which deals with only one, motto or ideal, then that is not a, well, it can be a social media to a limited extent, but not fully a social media. It's not an open social media site where anybody can just peep in and can offer to be a member or can offer to be a part of it. So social media is a much more complicated term nowadays. We also have to remember that social media is not simply, now what are one basic and very, very, well, I should say, important function of the social media is that it is not simply a broadcasting site. It is not simply a site where you broadcast. It is actually a site where you can exchange, you can make your own inputs, you can share, you can add content, you can delete content, you can kind of replace content, you can rearrange content, you can negotiate business, and you can also initiate and encourage other aspects of communication. So communication is the inevitable part, communication is the indispensable part of social media. But nowadays, it is not a simple broadcasting platform, because we are not in the 21st century. We are not passive consumers of the social media. We are active consumers of the social media, which means we make positive contributions. And these positive contributions can actually pronounce a change in the whole world. Because when we are saying we can share content, we can change content, we can make inputs to content, we have these possibilities, and so we can make positive additions. Yes. Now, I was talking, I began with saying that I will come back to email once again. Now, many of us, in fact, I wasn't aware until very recently that Twitter has a backup. That is, it has a backup and it is trying to inculcate lessons, or maybe group people together in a company. Nowadays, when I said that I would be coming to email once again, I just wanted to point out that emails and letters would very soon, another decade, be a thing of the past, maybe, because emails and letters are already becoming a bit obsolete. If not obsolete, at least less used. If obsolete would be a wrong term right now, maybe it would be a more appropriate term another decade later. But how are emails and letters not so functional when we think of other modern electronic softwares? Like, I'll give you an example, like microblogs and blogs. Now, the blogs are already groups like emails where you can have all your previous data. And you can also access something that is new. And you can also get information if you're a member of that blog, or you wish to visit that blog, even if you're not if you're not a member, if it's not a closed blog, then you can always get the workings or the feedback which we get from the email, and even something like news feed, quote unquote. So microblogs, blogs, and news feed are slowly, very slowly replacing the letters and the functionality of letters and emails. Now, when I'm saying this, I would like to make a small point. Letter writing had been a creative endeavor since times immemorial. Since people learned to pen down their thoughts, there has been letters ever since. Whether you were a creative person or not, we always have heard our parents, our family, our friends, and we have a genre of the novel, which is the epistolary form in which the story progresses through the medium of letters. Yes, of course. So you see, letters will always be in vogue, but modern letters of related to business, related to communication, which are not creative letters, or which may be creative in the with the fact that if they are supposed to convince people, for people, groups of people, bodies for business, they ought to be creative in a different sense. So the idea of creativity, I was trying to hinge on this point, and I've tried to explore this idea of creativity in technical communication, which was not. I think my phone is making a lot of sound. Just give me a moment. I'll just because this is disturbing. Yeah, and this is interesting because I'll talk about disturbance in communication as well. Yeah, once more. So yeah, we were talking about creativity, and creativity from the point of view of the fact that where is creativity in social media? Now, we don't associate creativity with very with very serious business content, or with very very should we say functional contents of writing, or modes of writing, or modes of writing that are intended to garner results in the world of marketing, in the world of business, in the world of economics, etc. But I would suggest that creativity has always been there, because it is creativity with a new angle as to how we approach परी रहो यहाँ पे. Hello. Can you see me? Hello, can you hear me? Dr. Kundu, can you hear me? Dr.
Yes,
Kundu, am I
D.
in? Can you hear me?
Yes, D. You are audible and
Dr.
visible both.
Kundu, am I audible?
Yes, D.
Hello?
You are audible and visible
Yes,
both.
I'm so okay. Thank you. I'm so sorry. It just took 15 minutes away. I'll come back to where I was speaking. Yes, we were speaking about the idea of creativity in social media. Over social media that would handle business, over social media that would handle marketing, over social media that would manipulate and help to manage economics across the globe. And so now the function of social media is much more, and we can say always that creativity, the idea of creativity has changed in recent times, and the idea of identity also has received a total switchover. I would like to mention a particular work which is an important work and which is called The Mode of Information by Mark Poster. uh, uh, and It is Mark, Poster. Now, Mark Poster, well, argues that in the social media and in electronic media, both, not so much in social media, but yes, social media where we have groups like the wiki groups, like, for example, the microblogs. He argues that identity of the creative writer is nullified because what we see are messages which are encrypted for their information and for their importance of the information which they provide, not so much for the way they provide information. And so our creativity is also hampered. Just as creativity is lost to an extent, unless and until it achieves the desired target, and this is where my connection was disrupted. I was talking about targets being achieved through creativity. And that is the reason why I said that this is a creativity of a different kind. So, going back onto that, Mark Posters argues how identity and creativity both are lost. Now, as I said, and I would repeat myself because of this intervening gap or break due to, I'm sorry for this lapse on my part. I would like to also hint that, as I said, that internet in which we communicate with emails and letters are fast, becoming a bit out of circulation due to the prevalence of other, more adequate or more developed softwares like wikiblogs, blogs, and news feed. We can also say that nowadays, you see, job resumes we get over Twitter, or we it is taught over FB and Twitter. So job resumes can be had over LinkedIn, job resumes can be had over Instagram, and there can be a circulation of such resumes as well, so that you know which to pick from and which to take ideas from. So it is not a thing of the classroom that we actually believe job resumes to be. And previously, long time back, we knew that we had classes where CV writing was taught. We had classes where the covering letter was taught. But now we have ready-made resumes, absolutely in a huge bulk, over Twitter, over wiki links which we can access and which we can incorporate. Now we come to the concept of teaching proper. Now this was about social media, this was a little about social media. Now I will talk about what is communication. I have a few they aren't very clear, but of course they aren't hazy as well, and I'll read out if there's a problem. uh, we all know, and I will not repeat that, what is communication. Communication is the art of getting your message across. And in communication process, there are two end points. One is the sender and one is the potential receiver. Now, the receiver can be many, but the sender has to be one, or it can also be now as in a group, because the concept of the sender and receiver singly as well as in a group is also there. Now, when from one end of the sender to the other end of the receiver, the passing line or the passing channels are many. Now, these channels are very important because it houses two very important concepts: how the message is transmitted, how the message is encoded or decoded. Okay, now if the sender is encoding a message, if he is sending a message, then the decoder is the receiver. And when the message passes the channel or goes through the channel, there can be barriers. I was talking about barrier. Just now, a barrier happened. That is the barrier of the internet, and my connection was well, it went away. So barriers can be there also from the sender to the receiver. There can be a stumbling block. There can be an internet failure. There can be some kind of a problem if there is a wrong message, bar, or maybe the wrong message address, and it doesn't reach the receiver. So this is the basic communication process, and we have communication as a discipline which is taught in professional institutes, it is taught in colleges, it is taught in undergrads, it is taught in postgrads if somebody is opting for management studies, it is taught before campusing and campus interviews. So you see, communication is very important for landing you a job. But having said this, we would also say, I would like to comment on the fact that 30 years back, communication classes were really classes. What I mean by really classes is that there was a teacher and there were a group of students or a class full of students who used to listen to the teacher and who used to understand what the teacher is being said. So the process was, I speak, quote unquote, you listen. So that was the way things were taught. But now it has changed visibly. And one very good example is the virtual classroom that I'm now holding in front of you. This is a virtual classroom because due to COVID, or I would have really been to Midnapur College or anywhere else to deliver a lecture, and all seminars and all webinars are taking place in this manner. Now, it is not only because I've given you an example with the COVID crisis, but actually the most happening thing is we are doing away with the model of the classroom as such. And why are we doing away with the model of the classroom is because virtual classrooms are much more easily accessible from home. They are cost effective, cost economic, because students from across the globe can connect. They can sit in their own little corners, they can sit in their own little countries, states, places, and they can connect over a person who is speaking to them. Now this has been done with the help of electronic technologies like podcasts, for example. This is being done with the help of electronic technologies like, you all know, PowerPoint has always been there. But the podcast is comparatively a new invention. This has been done with various, Google meetings and with various other softwares, in which business is being communicated. And there is no longer a teacher delivering a lecture. There may be online videos, and online videos are helpful on two counts. When I'm teaching you communication, when I'm teaching students communication, they might not be able to see my body language, or my body language may be constricted to myself sitting only on a chair. But communication also teaches how to really carry yourself in business, in a job. How to walk, how should your gesture, how should your posture be during meetings, and how does a person sitting in a group become conspicuous if his body language, if his body distancing, or if his attitude, his physical responses and physical nuances that he lets out voluntarily or involuntarily does not qualify him to be the professional he needs to be. So you see, these very minute nitty gritties of what in communication language we call kinesis and chronemics. Chronemics and kinesis both are related to the distance that you maintain while talking, or your body language. When I'm talking to my boss, I cannot just go and barge into him, or I cannot keep a distance of, say, 10 centimeters from him. I need to maintain a further distance so that he does not feel uncomfortable, or I do not feel uncomfortable when somebody comes to talk to me. He cannot just come to me and just bang into my face. So this is actually being taught in communication process. This is actually been taught or being taught in communication, not in the help not with the help of a classroom with a teacher teaching you, but with the help of online videos which show what happens when a collection of people, a group come together in meetings, and how they try to, collect, gather, give information, exchange information. Go and take it outside. I don't want it here. Go and take that and keep it inside. Just give me a moment. Go and take it outside. I don't want it there. No. Yes, I'm so sorry about that. That would have been a distraction. So, as I was saying, communication nowadays is not taught over a classroom, and we have virtual classrooms where literally we teach over online videos, we teach over, things like, uh, Wiki Meets, Google Meets, we teach, through podcasts and another variety of devices which help us to, get more than we would have got in a classroom. And today we have the concept of the smart classroom as well. So the smart classroom is a really smart thing, and it can give us more about communication and tell us and let us know more about communication than ordinary communication models would. Now, there is also, before I show you my slides, there is also something called, you see, the concept of classes getting over. Because nowadays, you see, the word teacher is fast evaporating, because in more you see developed countries, we don't have teachers, we have trainers, we have instructors. And these trainers, instructors, and associates, research associates they are called, because they help you in teaching as well, and they are themselves researching. So research associates, not teachers, of course, instructors and trainers, they say that there are professionals sitting before them. It's not only teenage students, or not only undergrad students, or not only university going students. There are professionals who come for a term. They may come for 1 week, 2 week, they may come for 2 months, they might come for a fall semester, or they might come for a spring semester. And for these people, these professionals, each garnering for different categories of jobs, nowadays the classroom has probably evaporated. So it is more of a flexible training model where we take the help of information, electronic technology. In fact, I would like to comment by saying that information technology and rhetoric not in the classical sense of the term, but the selection of and choosing of words, and the choosing of language, so more properly information technology, and in a few cases rhetoric as well, determines the material and cultural production of a country. So information technology through electronic media has become so very important. So, and here it is, social media comes in, because social media, as I pointed out earlier, it is not only entertainment, it is also business, it is also economics, it is also management, it is also advertising, it is also controlling, it is also making potential stakeholders and customers come under one roof. So all these things are done with the help of social media. And I would like to come to the very basics of communication. I have my first slide as to, I just want to share my screen, and I'll share the screen with one particular slide, and it is here. Professor Kundu, Dr. Kundu, please tell me if the screen isn't showing.
No, it's not showing.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, it's
Can you
it's
hear
not
me?
showing. Yes, I can hear you, but it's not
Okay,
showing.
it's not showing. fine. I'll just
So the way I requested you to share your screen
okay.
yesterday.
I'll just okay. So I'd better I'll it's better I'll can you see me?
Yes, yes.
Can
You
you
are
see
visible.
me, Dr. Kundu?
Yes, the you are visible and audible both.
Okay. So but I'll try this another moment. I mean, I'll just see if yes, yes. Is it visible now,
No, no,
Dr.
no,
Kundu? Is it visible now?
no. The
Is it
it's
visible?
still no, still not visible. So
It's
you
still
have the
not
option.
visible.
You
But
have the
I
option
have clicked on the
share
option
screen.
of screen. Uh,
Yes, share screen. Then
okay. Okay.
application window.
Since you can see me.
Yes,
Okay. Can you see me? Can you see me?
yes, yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
I'll talk about. Has it come? Has it come?
No, 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 no. The
Hello.
you have the option. You have the option
It's
share
not come.
screen. You have the option share screen. Then you opt
Yes.
select application window, and then
Yeah, I have done
let it
that.
run in the
I have
background.
done that. I have done that.
Yes. Now let it run in the background and just you operate your PPT. So you go on your PPT. In that case, you just
Okay.
click on share.
Okay. Dr. Kundu, I'll speak. I'll speak. Yes.
Okay, okay.
Yes, because a lot of time we waste. Now you can hear me and see me both, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
See, I'll give you a list. I'll talk about written communication channels. This was supposed to be shown over the PPT. But how many kinds and categories of written communication channels are there? First is an email. We can have memos, we can have letters, we can have reports, we can have proposals, we can have flyers, we can have brochures, we can have faxes, we can have internet websites, intranet websites, extranet websites, instant messaging, and blogging. Now, there are like written communication channels, there are also oral communication channels, and I'll read them out. Lending meets, conducting interviews, making calls, managing others, participating in teleconferences and video conferences, facilitating training sessions, participating in collaborative team projects, providing customer service, making telephone calls, leaving voicemail messages, making presentations at conferences, participating in interpersonal communication, and conducting performance reviews. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, yes,
Audible,
you're
Dr.
audible.
Kundu?
Yes, yes, yes.
Hello? Y- y-
You're audible.
Yes, I'm audible and visible. Okay, fine. Now I'll go on to the second. Okay. Now I'll go on to the second slide. I'm sorry about not being able to show you, but I'll just talk about it as to what this second slide has. See, the basic concept of communication nowadays in the office is that sometimes we are very, sparing with writing. We don't want to write. We always want the computer to help us. And with regard to this, I would like to say how, in modern communication processes, you see, what is the role of writing? Writing is such that we want to make it as short as possible. When we are talking about memos and agendas and minutes, we keep it to the bare minimum because this is for the sole this is primarily and functionally for the sake of sharing information. So bare minimum, we often avoid full sentences, and if possible we often follow a model. And so this following of model is again very important because this also shows us how we conduct our writing business. And The slide which I was intending to show you is just coming, but I'm afraid it might take a longer time. Now, when I was talking about, if when it comes, I will go on to it. When I was talking about interpersonal and intrapersonal communication, that too is also very important in the sphere of an office space. Another thing which is very important in today's world is crisis management through communication. Crisis management through communication. Now, yes, I will talk about crisis management, but before that, I will talk about the importance of the communication procedures that we use. We use PowerPoints 80%. We use emails 100%. We use memos and letters around 60 to 50%. And we use reports less than 50%. Now, why did I say that we don't want writing is because reports are the least attempted kind of device that we want to follow in modern technologies, in modern communication processes, because reports are often lengthy, though they are very helpful in conducting the communication process, because there are various kinds of reports like marketing reports, field reports. Then there can be reports as varied as company reports, emergency reports. They can be the doctor's report. They can be the report of an imminent function or a press release or a press meet. But they require of expertise and training, for which reports are only 40% of our business communication. And the most important ones, as I pointed out, are PowerPoints through which we can teach, train, and carry out the daily business. Now, I would like, I don't know if I'm left with much time, but I think I would like to, there is a request that I would have to wind up. I'll just go very fast and I'll just wind up. Uh, Dr. Kundu, do I have, how many minutes do I have?
Yes,
How many
the
minutes do I have, Dr. Kundu?
we can continue for five
Do I have 5 minutes?
5 minutes. Yes, yes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes. Then I would just wind it up. I would just, yes, I would like to wind up. Hello.
So
Yeah, can you
yes,
hear me and see me?
yes, we have questions
Yes.
also.
So
Two,
I've
two or three questions.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll just wind up in 1 minute, and then we'll have the 3 minutes for the
Okay,
questions. What I was trying to
okay.
convey through this combination of yes, what I was trying to convey through this, this is a vast area and needs much more deliberation and discussion. But I was trying to show people the overlapses and the interconnection and the interstices between social media, electronic media, communication, creativity, and how writing for the social media, which was there in my slides, I'm so sorry because of my incompatibility in handling maybe the machine. But you see, all these things are so interrelated that we can't do one with the other. And the basic is communication. There are communication models, there are communication theories, there are communication, procedures which are followed in very high tech companies to train their employees before they are employed. And this entirely is a new discipline which is on the go, which is on the move. And I believe probably the most important area which still is developing day by day. Yes, we can have a few questions if Dr. Kundu wishes. Yes, are there any questions, Dr. Kundu? Are there any questions? Yes? Hello, am I audible? Dr. Kundu, you
Yes,
said
yes,
that
yes,
there are questions.
yes.
See, I don't think that social media is always fun. It is very, very serious sometimes, and social media can lead you to the police, and social media can make you a victim, and social media can fabricate your identity. Social media can be dangerous, extremely dangerous. And you need to have a protocol. You cannot be totally free, because remember, social media is for everybody to see. In today's world, information is power, but information can also be threatening, extremely dangerous. Yeah. I think it is much less of a fun as much as it is serious. I beg to differ with regard to this question. Yeah. Any other question? Yes, SSL is the secure socket layer, which is just a terminology related to the very basics of computer software, which is whenever we have something on the address bar of Google, we start with HTTP. But you will also see that there is something called the HTTPS, and then there are two slashes, and then there is the colon mark, and it starts. Now, the HTTPS is very rarely seen, and these are secure sites for you to make a website, or for you to land into a web serving site. And there are certain sites where if you don't have the HTTPS, you cannot log in. You see, and there are HTTPS and secure socket, level, where once the message has been received by the intended recipient, it gets unencrypted. The computer language is unencrypted. So that is a secure kind of a thing. Yes, I think you are right, because we don't put in complete sentences in the social media, so our creativity and our vocabulary suffers. It does, but then it mustn't be the norm. It mustn't be the norm when we are writing ordinary letters, or when we are communicating, or when we are writing, newspaper articles, or book reviews, say for example. Even news is now social media, because you see, previously we had newspapers, but now we have newspapers over online newspapers. So the print media has gone, the print media and has amassed, has been amassed by the online media, the print media, because we print media, the newspapers were print media, but now we have newspapers online, or any other, a kind of things which related to information. So the print media is also being amassed. Yes.
So,
Any other
thank you,
questions?
Nodhi. So, thank you, Di, for giving us this precious time and entertaining each and every questions. Now, we would end the session with the formal vote of thanks, and it will be delivered by Mondira Panda. So, I would like to request our students, Mondira Panda, to give you the formal vote of thanks.
Am I audible, sir? Hello?
You're audible.
Am I audible?
Yes, Mondira, you're audible. Go on.
Hello? Hello, sir. Am I audible?
You are audible. Go
I
on.
think you are audible. At least I can hear you. I can hear
Thank
you.
you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. According to St. Ambrose, no duty is more urgent than that of returning thanks. So I'm delighted to have been given the pleasant duty of delivering vote of thanks this time. Good evening, everyone. This is Mandira from Midnapur College Autonomous. As all good things come to an end in life, so does today's wonderful lecture. On behalf of the Department of English, or on my own behalf, I want to propose a vote of thanks to those who have directly or indirectly contributed to this lecture organized by our department. At the outset, I cordially thank our resource person, Dr. Pinky Isha Madam, Assistant Professor of English, Rabindra Bharati University. We are really enlightened with your knowledge and presence, Madam. We are really thankful to our Honorable Principal Sir, Dr. Gopal Chandra Bera, for his inspiration to host this lecture. I'd like to thank our Professor Tanmay Kundu sir for his enthusiastic support and initiative to make this turbulent period charming, at least for some hours per day. A heartfelt thanks to all the participants from all over India for their active participation. With these warm words and a kind message, we move to the end of today's session. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Manvira.
much. Thank you so much, Dr. Kundu, and thank you, Professor Bera.
Thank you, Dee. Okay, Dee. Okay. Swagadda.
Should we begin? We are still live, right?
So, Nilanjana Deb, yes.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Just a phone call came. So is Nilanjana
Yes.
has she joined us? Okay. She is joining us.
So, good evening, Dee.
Hi,
Yes. Are you audible?
I think the screen is
connection is. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, you are audible.
audible, but her
All
screen is
right.
frozen.
Hmm.
Yes.
As long as
Nilanjana,
I'm
your screen.
audible, that's fine.
Okay. Okay. So Tanmay, we should continue, right? We are
Yes.
still live. Okay. Okay. Um, Hello everyone. Good afternoon once again. On my part, I'm Dr. Shoigat Sarkar from the Department of English, Jadavpur College Autonomous. And I welcome you once again. Many of you are already tuned in, but if someone is joining us for the first time today, I welcome you, and I welcome all of you to yet another intriguing session, which appears or promises to be an intriguing session of our ongoing online lecture series. In this session, we are fortunate to have amongst us a very noted and well-known academician of West Bengal, whose reputation, of course, goes beyond Bengal. And she is a scholar extraordinaire and also a teacher of the highest quality. So I do emphasize this before I formally introduce her to you, that it is our good fortune that she has kindly consented to deliver this lecture. She is Dr. Nilanjana Deb, and is an associate professor of English at Jadavpur University. She was a recipient of the Shastri Indo-Canadian Fellowship twice and Indo-Australian Fellowship. Her fields of specialization include
There
post-colonial.
seems to be some problem with both audio and video.
Well, I believe I am audible. Tanmay, could you confirm?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes,
You are
the
audible.
connection is back, but it's a bit intermittent. You'll have to bear with me.
Okay, okay. So maybe I should continue with my introduction, Dee. Hopefully, by the
Yes,
time you
yes.
are about to speak, things are going to be properly sorted out on your end. So as I was saying, and these are the technical hassles that we cannot do anything about. These are the things that you have to get adjusted to as time will go by. So continuing on, her fields of specialization include post-colonial literatures, aboriginal literatures, cultures of protest, and diaspora studies. She was a core group member of international collaborations of the Department of English, JU, such as Envisioning the Indian City and Commodities and Culture in the Colonial World with the University of Liverpool and King's College London, respectively. She led the Human Ecology team at JEU under the Indo-EU collaboration Project Equal. She recently completed a British Library-funded project on digitizing and the endangered archives of the British India Association. She has been engaged in several projects on labor migration through the colonial port of Calcutta from 1840 to 1947. She is presently co-investigator in the RUSA 2.0 project at Jadavpur University on bodies of difference, which reaches out to urban, peri-urban, and rural schools to develop pedagogical tools and resources to sensitize teachers as well as students on how to deal with bullying on grounds of gender, caste, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, and other forms of difference. So it is our indeed good fortune to have a scholar of a stature and variety of interest amongst us today. Before I formally invite her to deliver her talk, let me just add one thing, that if you have any question, if you are joining us via YouTube or Facebook, please drop in the questions in the chat box, and later Professor Tonman Kundu, who is the coordinator of the PG wing our department, will be making it visible to our speaker. Now I formally request Dr. Nilanjana Deb to please deliver her lecture entitled Life Without the Promise of Stability, Reflections on the Community, the State and the Planet in a Post-COVID-19 World. Nilanjana Deb.
Thank you so much. And I think the technical problems that we faced are a reminder that we now live in a world without stability indeed. Um, Contingent upon internet connections, broadband speeds, the availability of smartphones, and whatnot. I'd like to thank Tonmoy and the entire team, the faculty at Midnapur College, for inviting me to talk about a subject that has taken on urgency in these last few months. I do not think that at this time last year we had any idea that we would need to reflect upon the community, the state, and the planet in a post pandemic world. Um, at the very beginning, I would want to begin with a line from a song by Rabindra Tagore. বরিশো ধরা মাঝে শান্তির বাড়ি শুষ্ক হৃদয় লয়ে আছে দাঁড়ায় ঊর্ধ্বমুখে নরনারী কেন এ হিংসা দেশ কেন এ ছদ্মবেশ কেন এ মান ও অভিমান I begin because I will have occasion to return to these lines at the end of my talk. Um, Anat Singh, in her brilliant book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, says when we hear of islands being swarmed or people losing their jobs or species becoming extinct, we imagine this precarity to be an exception to how the world works. But what if precarity is the condition of our time? Precarity is the condition of being vulnerable to others. Unpredictable encounters transform us. We are not in control even of ourselves. Thinking through precarity changes the very social analysis that we do. The most convincing timeline of the Anthropocene dates not with the beginning of agriculture in primitive society, but with the advent of modern capitalism. Imagining the human since the rise of capitalism entangles us with the ideas of progress and the spread of techniques of alienation that turn humans and other living beings into resources. These techniques continue to segregate humans, to define and police identities, obscuring our collaborative survival. Another term that I will come back to at the end, collaborative survival. As we move faster into the era of visible climate change and a new China-centric world order in the post-COVID-19 world, we need to ask, can we live inside this regime and still exceed it, still transcend it? We need to look at the economic and ecological implications of this question, to imagine a world where survival might still be salvaged for future generations. Let me begin with discussing what I understand as precarity, and also to bring into our discussion the idea of a precaritariat as opposed to a proletariat, a precaritariat. The idea of precarity is linked to the fact that much of the world's population lacks stable incomes now, steady incomes. Work is largely informal, temporary, or contingent. Um, Unstable livelihoods mark our present world. Everything from performing daily wage labor, selling small commodities, sourcing task-based jobs on the internet. These exemplify some of precarity's many forms. Precarity has always been a feature of capitalist societies. It's not something new that I'm talking about. And that precariousness has perpetually characterized working people's lives, especially in the global south. The current precarity is simply an intensification of a distinct phase of capitalist development associated with neoliberalism. Precaritization, the process by which one is pushed into a position of precarity. The process by which we are put into a precarious position transforms the collective identities and the collective politics of the future. Precariousness is in our present time as well. And I want here to distinguish between precarity and precariousness in particular. Precariousness, I might argue, is a general ontological condition of alienation, vulnerability, displacement, feelings of anxiety, disenfranchisement, loss of hope for the future that affects people of all socioeconomic groups. So it's not just the working classes or what I call the precaritariat, but people from the middle class, the elites also who suffer from this feeling, this affect called precariousness. Judith Butler's writing, and I refer here to her work Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence, which came out in 2004, is a cornerstone for the growing body of writing on precarity. Butler draws a distinction between these two terms, precarity and precariousness. She sees precariousness as a generalized human condition that stems from the fact that after all humans are interdependent on each other. All are vulnerable. In her scheme, precarity is different precisely because it is unequally distributed. Precarity is experienced by the marginalized, the poor and disenfranchised people exposed to economic insecurity, violence, forced migration, and injury. Further, social value is ascribed to some lives and some bodies, while it is denied to others. Neoliberalism, war, and the climate crisis render these inequalities especially visible, especially acute. And Butler sees the potential for emancipation in embracing the common circumstance of precariousness as against the unequal fate of precarity. She rejects politics that aims at achieving stability for an elite or a select group and favors an egalitarian precariousness for all as a liberating moment in the future. And so we come to this idea of the emerging global class, a class that is emerging in every nation across the globe, the precariat or the precaritariat. The precariat, you can see this emergence already from the 1980s, the late 80s, with the vision of open markets, liberalized markets. You see from the late 80s the gradual dismantling of institutions of social solidarity that stood against free market forces and which in a sense weakened the bargaining power that marginalized groups, labor groups had distinctly reduced their bargaining power. Also, with the entry of China and other large emerging economies into the labor market, you have the sudden influx of billions of workers to the global labor supply. Most of these, especially from India and China, were used to earning 1/50th of what workers in the developed world receive as wages. So, as productivity could rise faster in these emerging market economies, there has been a downward pressure on wages across the world in all economies. This was intensified by the labor flexibility policies, which in fact we are now seeing with great alarm also becoming the norm in the post pandemic world, that the laws that protect labor are gradually becoming more and more flexible. And also, the Silicon Revolution, the Internet Revolution, facilitated the relocation of production and employment to wherever in the world costs were lowest. And all this shaped a global class structure superimposed on existing old national structures. It's not as if transnationalism and globalization caused the erosion of national structures. I would argue that the connivance of governments in this process of globalization actually hardened national boundaries. And so we have a kind of pyramid forming. At the top, we have the elite earning huge incomes, wielding enormous political power. Below them, in income terms, are the salaried class, a shrinking group today with employment security and various benefits such as pensions. And I think many of you, particularly young people, are aware that this kind of salaried class is shrinking. More and more jobs are simply on a contract basis with no security for the future. Medical leave, paid holidays, all of these would be what the salaried class enjoys. Alongside them in income terms would be the group of skilled, highly skilled, what are called professions, who don't seek employment security but are frantically making money and in that sense endangered by burnout. Below them is the old working class, the proletariat, for whom trade unions have worked and for whom, in a sense, the welfare state evolves. The norm is paid labor with entitlements that are linked to the performance of labor. And this particular class is also shrinking because below it, in income terms, is the emergence of a growing precariat, living in economic uncertainty, in debt, chronic debt in most cases, where one mistake, one illness, one miscalculation can push entire families over the edge into socio-economic instability. There might be said to be three kinds of people in this formation, the precariat or the precariat. The first is those who have, in a sense, fallen from their status as members of old working class communities or families. They feel as their lives become increasingly precarious in the recession hit world, that they are not getting what their parents had or what their older peers had. They look backwards, feeling deprived of a real or imagined past. Not having much education, they listen to populist politicians who play on their fears, blame the other out there, and the other could be anybody, a migrant, a refugee, any other group that can be easily demonized. And these support very often the growing far right. The rise of right wing movements around the world has a lot to do with their populist claims drawing more and more members of the precariat. And this particular section of the precariat seems to be headed in that way, in the direction of the right, unless some new progressive politics can reach out to them. The second group are those who look back, migrants, workers with visas who look back at the homeland that they left behind in search of work, members of minority communities in many developing countries who feel deprived of stability in the present time, who feel deprived of a sense of belonging, as it were, and recognizing their status, the fact that they are dependent upon the majority's whims and fancies and biases, the fact that many of them are migrants whose very economic existence depends on whether they get a visa renewed or not. This particular category of the precariat will often be quiet politically, unless, of course, pressures become too great and there are episodes of rage, of violence. For example, you have the frequent rioting in Paris, where a lot of migrant workers from the Maghreb, the North African Maghreb, live. And very often you see their expressions of frustration coming out through riots in Paris. The third faction, in a sense, are the progressives. And this, in a sense, might eventually include many of our students who are presently college or university students in West Bengal from less privileged families, because they feel deprived of a future even before that future has arrived, so to speak. It consists of people who've been promised by their parents, by teachers, by politicians, that if they study hard and work hard, it will grant them a career. But this particular category of the emerging precariat will soon realize that they've been sold a kind of lottery ticket. They will come out into the future with unstable jobs, unstable incomes, and possibly a lot of debt. But this particular group is dangerous in a good way. They're unlikely to support the right wing. I remember this beautiful response that one of my students wrote. I had, as part of the assignments for my outgoing batch of MA students, asked them to write a response to the current crisis, the pandemic, the crisis of globalization, and so on. And one of them had etched this beautiful graphic text in which she writes below a beautiful illustration: "Watch us break the world down and build a new one in its place." So, in a sense, this emergent section of the precariat would reject old conservative political parties and are looking for a new politics, which they don't see in the old political spectrum. Indeed, don't even find that in the old structures of trade unionism and so on. Italian Marxists Michael Hart and Antonio Negri have been optimistic about this decline of a stable relationship to work, interestingly. They feel that since digital platforms like Uber, for example, and many of you know young men who have tried to become self-employed by, taking car loans and becoming Uber drivers, only to find that in the lockdown they cannot pay back their EMIs and they are hopelessly trapped in debt. So, digital platforms such as Uber can decenter the workplace, um, and in fact decenter work itself. So after the lockdown, only 1,000 Uber drivers were called by Uber to start operating again, leaving all the others in the lurch. In their view, the same automation that pushes many out of formal jobs also, in a sense, pushes those people into a politics of self-determination, the promise of decentralization and autonomous life worlds. They see the possibility of liberation in precarity as new social arrangements begin to emerge. Their subject is the multitude, not the old working class, um, which was a more singular entity in Marxist terms, but multitude is a much more heterogeneous population that does not have a common relationship to capital and is thus not really a class as such. The sociologist G. Standing enthusiastically endorses precarity as well. He sees this as the possibility of a new politics. Standing regards the global precariat as an emergent class with relationships to capital and self-interests that are very different from and sometimes opposed to older workers in unionized jobs. In Standing's assessment, the precariat is a multi-layered strata of various part-time workers, self-employed people, subcontractors, people who work in contract jobs, and so on. These people are not members of any working class. They don't express collective forms of solidarity. They don't have any affinity for labor politics as such. And I think that unions around the world need to take time to engage with the precariat, except for some educational institutions in the United States, some factories in the United States, and in Argentina. Unions around the world have stuck to their affiliations with the old working class and have not engaged with this emergent precariat. And remember, when I say the precariat, I'm also referring to the informal sector, the unorganized sector, which is increasingly being drawn into contractual labor work that puts them into a kind of antagonistic position vis-a-vis the more regular unionized working class. Unions need to engage with this informal sector. In many cities of the West, the loss of a working class position has happened over the space of 2 or 3 decades. And in a sense, a new kind of common sense seems to be emerging that perhaps individual strategies, family strategies, are better bets against joblessness than collective struggle pursued through unions. And you might say then that the precaritization of the world has actually hit the labor union movement hard. Um, One of the ways in which we see this happening in India, amongst many other developing countries, is the emergence and popularity of right-wing groups amongst the working classes and the precariat. So right-wing nationalist responses are possible outcomes. Um, so you have, for example, in many East European countries like Poland, politicians are summoning workers who've been dispossessed and turning their disillusionment into a support for a deeply xenophobic right-wing kind of nationalism against migrant workers. If you look at the rise of the Shiv Sena, for example, I used to wonder why someone like Namdev Dhasal, who was such an important founding member of the Dalit Panther movement, suddenly joined the Shiv Sena. And then I realized that it is because, the Shiv Sena won over the poor, the precariat that was emerging in India by offering services to underemployed and unemployed workers who were out of stable union jobs. In a sense, the failure of the trade union movement in places like Mumbai led to the rise of the Shiv Sena. So, anti-immigrant movements, racist movements, parties that mobilize precarious people now wield an increasingly powerful influence in countries all across the globe. It's important, I think, then for us as academics to now, work towards a closer charting and study of the livelihood activities that people are taking up in the era of climate change and the pandemic induced recession. The different kinds of identities, in a sense, that are emerging, that diverse groups of, laborers, the precariat, these identities that they are trying to form now, what alliances seem to be emerging, the kinds of organizing that they are doing, however innovative these might be vis-a-vis, older forms like labor unions, and to, in a sense, map these changes very carefully. And just as we need to study the more left-inspired or anarchist-inspired social movements that are emerging against precarity, and you might think of, for example, the Occupy movement that happened. Many of the movements that happened across the Arab world and North Africa also had an element of resistance to precarity. We need to look at, the ways in which existing unions are starting to engage with contingent workers or the underemployed. Um, Similarly, we also need to study the right wing very closely, the way in which right wing organizations mobilize dispossessed and vulnerable workers. In the new emerging world order, precarity within states is deeply linked to the emerging political or geopolitical order as well. Again, this is not something new that we are, theorizing. Dependency theory, the dependency theorists of the United States and the dependencistas of South America um, anticipated this as early as the 1970s. Writing in the context of mid-20th century anti-colonial movements, Andre Frank, Walter Rodney wrote against the modernization paradigm, which paradigm suggested that, underdeveloped nations, if they were given sufficient capital investment, would achieve development and be able to catch up, as it were, with the first world. So just give them capital investment and free markets, technology transfers, big loans, and they will be able to catch up with the West. Now, most of us who have studied post-colonial theory know that this is a fallacy, because in a sense developing countries can never catch up with the first world, because the first world, as it were, became the first world riding on the back of the colonial exploitation of the rest of the globe. So writers like Frank argued that dependency elites did the bidding of transnational capital, and neo-colonial regimes in the Third World continued this extractive political and economic relation of colonialism. This idea of the middleman class, so to speak, the middleman elite, the comprador elite, whereby resources and wealth flowed from the poor, formerly colonial satellite nations to benefit dominant capitalist countries who were known as the metropolis. I'm simplifying here for the sake of time. What the dependency theorists were saying. So underdevelopment, according to the dependencistas and Frank, was not really a failure of development on the part of Latin American or African or smaller Asian countries, but an active process whereby colonial and neo-colonial powers impoverished and exploited the third world. These interventions situated the problem of informal labor, which you might see as an early formulation of the precariat, within a debate about capitalist development, colonialism, and neocolonialism. So the map of the modern world that they developed, of course, found further expression in world systems theory, which traced the unequal relations between core and periphery, semi-periphery regions as capitalism spread across the world. An important thing to note, and I think this comes in handy when we're thinking about precarity in the post-COVID world, is that following Louis Althusser and his social formation theory, many anthropologists noted that feudal economies, caste-based economies, kin-based economies continued side by side in many third world countries alongside the emergent capitalist market economy. In fact, capitalism hooked into these older economic formations, though it remained the dominant economic formation. So following Althusser, many economists suggested that this articulation of different modes of production accounted for the coexistence of peri-capitalist, non-capitalist, and capitalist social relations. They recognized that the capitalist mode of production was not necessarily totalizing, and that peri-capitalist and capitalist relations could co-occur within a given social formation. And this, I think, again holds hope, because as Anna Tsing says in her book, that what do we salvage out of the ruins of capitalism? Perhaps there is hope that these peri-capitalist formations, the fact that there are parallel small economies that run alongside and sometimes in collaboration with capitalism. Perhaps we need to track their trajectories. We need to see how these might come together to form a kind of assemblage that sustains the precariat in the coming world. So I'd like to here also mention what Partha Chatterjee says, which is that perhaps that the majority of the world's workforce, including in India, particularly in the informal sector, are destined to remain on the outside of capitalist wage relations. So he suggests that India's subaltern populations often pursue social movements that make demands on the state based on citizenship, rather than engaged in work-based struggles or confront class relations as workers. And I think you see this very clearly in the way in which, even though, when migrant workers were, trying to come home by the thousands, there were protests happening. This was largely seen as a crisis of workers. Even Dalit organizations didn't, factor in that most of these migrant workers were actually Dalit or Adivasi, and therefore, that their intervention was necessary. So, the fact that we have mobilization of socially marginalized communities, not along the lines of unionization or along the lines of class relations, class warfare, but as a demand made upon the state of a kind of citizenship, right? That is also something that we see as a very distinctive feature of certain kinds of precarity, particularly in South Asia. The condition of wagelessness and the need to earn a living is the defining moment of dispossession. The wage is only one life outcome and one social relation amongst many that follow from wagelessness. So we might actually return to that older concept of livelihoods as opposed to the narrower concept of job or work, to account for the many ways in which people make a living in the contingent world of post-COVID recession. So, for example, retired parents who are earning pensions around the world are opening their homes for their now unemployed or jobless adult children, allowing them back and giving a portion of their pension benefits, which they got from their, jobs amongst their many dependents. So it's a very interesting situation where pensioners are now becoming supporters of the new jobless. Family members pursue a range of informal opportunities. Uh, so you have suddenly, for example, if you look at Kolkata, the emergence of small family enterprises where people are cooking food and providing home delivery services to the elderly or senior citizens who cannot go out to buy vegetables and so on during the pandemic. All of these endeavors and also cooperative endeavors might help to provision the household, and which might be seen as peri-capitalist enterprise, parallel to capitalism. Today, if you look at the world around us, forced bonded laborers, also prisoners, in fact, provide services, produce consumer goods, while billions of people live in what might be called multiple poverty or multi-dimensional poverty. Poverty of health, poverty in terms of education, poverty in terms of living standards. The planet of slums, as Mike Davis called it in his 2006 book. As Anand Singh says, industrial formation turned out to be a bubble of promise, followed by lost livelihoods and damaged landscapes. If we end this story with decay, she says, we abandon all hope, or turn to other sites around the world that replicate the cycle of promise and ruin, promise and ruin, promise and ruin. And in the New World Order, we see, in a sense, China, for example, its Belt and Road policy, replicating the older patterns of promise and ruin once again. Smaller national economies struggling with recession and poverty are seduced by China's promise of large loans and infrastructural support into giving away much of their economic sovereignty, becoming ready markets for Chinese goods, supplying land, ports, and resources to the growing capitalist empire. The global economy that China seeks to dominate today in the post-COVID world is integrated, and I don't think China can overlook that. And massive and rapid movements of capital across national boundaries are a dominant feature. But it's impossible to make sense of this globalization without also taking into account competition among national economies and national states carrying out policies to promote competitiveness, to promote the free movement of capital, while at the same time confining labor within national boundaries and subjecting it to harsh disciplines enforced by the state. So while India is trying to invite foreign investment in the post-COVID world, competing with China, showing that we are a more democratic country, we didn't ruin the world like China did. It is at the same time making statements like in Uttar Pradesh, labor laws will be suspended entirely. So you see that contrast building up. Imperialism today is enforced by means of debt and financial manipulation, FDIs, and as you can see very well, a militarism that asserts the dominance of a few states like China, Russia, and the United States at present, enforcing their freedom to navigate the global economy without hindrance. And their multinational corporations are able to ignore labor and environmental conditions through which their products are made around the globe. So in a sense, ecology and economy are hopelessly intertwined in the precarious condition of the globe today. As country after country now falls into the Chinese debt and infrastructure trap, we forget the old lessons learned from the time of European imperialism. The fact that capitalism, in whatever mask it may come garbed, needs to keep expanding to survive. As Lenin had put it, imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. If capitalism cannot expand, it goes into crisis. And so to expand, it will keep on trying to create puppet governments, friendly subject states, create war or war-like situations. So the globalization and expansionism in the new world order comes at a time when the world is already in economic and ecological crisis, as I said. Um, it's a very difficult situation where do we accuse China of buying large chunks of South American rainforests? Chinese companies are buying forested land in South America to prospect for oil and coal at a time when the world has already lost 80% of its forests. But do we really point only a finger at China? Because in the past, other first world economies have done the same thing. They've systematically destroyed forests in the world's temperate zones for the purpose of industrial development. The fact that now we have these new superpowers like China and an old one that is trying to reinvent itself, Russia, drilling into the tundra, draining ancient lakes and watersheds in Tibet, creating puppet governments. Really, I mean, all of the countries that are buying into the Belt and Road policy have very little say left about ecology or economy in their own countries. This is very reminiscent, isn't it, of the time when the USA and the USSR had competed to indoctrinate nations under their own highly unsustainable visions of development and progress. After World War II, modernization was supposed to have filled the world, both communist and capitalist, with jobs, standard employment with stable wages and benefits. Such jobs, sadly, are rarer than ever before, and most people today are now becoming dependent on irregular livelihoods. As with the earlier blocks, the China-led Belt and Road bloc does not ask the fundamental question, is this trajectory of modernization necessary? In a world of increasing precarity, is this the direction in which to move? It is a great paradox of our present political situation that just at the time when the deepening of the planet-wide ecological crisis shows the limits of our national borders, everywhere there are loud calls led by the right wing that is manipulating the precariat, calls for a return to the safety of borders. Although people don't seem to feel acutely that ecological questions cross national boundaries, that countries need to collaborate on this. They concentrate on a proxy of this crisis, which is the crossing of boundaries by larger masses of desperate refugee and migrant populations. The rejection of traumatized migrants, who are now a major section of the global precariat, is how most people in effect translate the coming crisis. As sea levels rise and the climate changes, we are seeing also the emergence of a new category of people joining the ranks of the precariat. The existing refugee crisis looming all over the world is being further deepened as more and more environmental refugees around the world begin to seek refuge in locations of economic or geographical privilege, alongside older economic and political refugees. In the new world order, what global institutions then might we imagine? Because the United Nations, WHO, all of these regulatory bodies have clearly failed. What alliances and solidarities might we imagine, might we dare to imagine, that might allow for both ecological and economic sustainability for the wretched of the earth? The Marxist geographer David Harvey um, offers a take on a politics for the age of precarity. He imagines that radical social transformation, should it come, will emerge from cities where different sorts of laborers, factory, service, unorganized, precarious, etc., live, and where vast amounts of surplus value are invested, consumed, and fought over. The many distinct classes of workers do not meet in a factory or in a specific workplace, but they do come together in community and political groups and neighborhoods, in urban centers, and in assorted struggles to wrest control over this surplus value. As voracious users of capital, cities, according to Harvey, might be the logical and necessary sites for revolt. While a coherent oppositional movement that brings together urban struggles, from environmental sustainability to immigrant rights and workers' rights, housing rights, has not presently converged, the task, according to him, is to conceptualize such a unity. On the other hand, Gandhians and a diverse range of anarchists, particularly green anarchists, would argue that revolution would emerge out of the villages and small towns across the global south that have seen the ill effects of globalization, development, and over dependence on cities, and choose a path of agro-based, as opposed to petrochemical or plastics-based, sustainable living that is radically decentralized and autonomous. I'm reminded of the migrant worker, this much televised image of the migrant worker that came back on a Shramik special train, and on returning to his village after an epic journey during the lockdown, kissed the earth of his home village and said he would never go back to the city in pursuit of elusive dreams again. Therein might lie the seeds of an agro-based revolution. The need for planetary consciousness in this new world order is not a utopian desire. It is deeply linked with the fate of the precariat. Paul Gilroy highlights the deeply political nature of this consciousness in his work, A New Cosmopolitanism. The planet, I quote from Gilroy here, it's important, I think. The planetary consciousness I am invoking is a precious result of the years of anti-colonial conflict. It is now a stimulus to multiculturalism and a support for anti-racist solidarities. It was linked to a change of scale, a wholesale reimagining of the world which had moral and political dimensions. That world became not a limitless globe, but is imagined now as a small, fragile, and finite place. one planet among others, with strictly limited resources that are unequally allocated. It is a critical orientation and an oppositional mood triggered by the comprehension of the simple fact that environmental and medical crises do not stop at national boundaries, and by a feeling that the sustainability of our species is itself now in question. Dipesh Chakraborty writes in his rejoinder to several critiques of his essay Climate of History for Theses that capitalism is not the only story that can be told if we consider the present situation. He says, if one could imagine someone watching the development of life on this planet on an evolutionary scale, they would have to tell a story about Homo sapiens rising to the top of the food chain within a very short period in that history. The more involved story of the rich and the poor, the differences of rich and poor, would be a matter of finer resolution in that story. The ecological overshoot of humanity requires us now to zoom into the details of intra-human injustice, such as injustices of race, caste, and class. Otherwise, we don't see the sufferings of our fellow humans, but also the need to zoom out of that history, or else we will not see the suffering of other species and, in a manner of speaking, of the planet itself. Zooming in and zooming out are about shuttling between different scales, perspectives, different levels of abstraction. One level of abstraction does not cancel out the other or render it invalid. And this is something I think that particularly the new left needs to understand, that focusing on economic inequalities does not somehow cancel out the need to focus on ecological issues that concern the world right now. Hence, the need to imagine a new era of collaborative survival, of which India, China, and other countries must necessarily be agents. Precarity must be addressed alongside precariousness, cutting across class and national lines. It would be absurd to propose a catch-all solution. There is none in sight, as nationalist ambitions and imperialist enterprises ravage the planet's resources and add new members to the ranks of the precariat. At a personal level, though, I might ask you a simple question that Oliver Burkeman has said in his essay, Who Cares? Which problems facing the modern world do you really care about the most, as measured by how emotionally exercised you get and how willing are you to take action? Apart from brief, intense flashes of sadness or anger in the midst of lockdown ennui at what's happening to migrant workers or to the planet, the shameful reality is that for the non-precariat, the fate of the planet or the fate of the precariat is not a regular cause of motivating, life-changing emotion. The question then arises, how much do we really love the world in which we live? How much do you love your fellow human beings and the planet really? It's not a naive question, because without love, you cannot really make serious changes to your life, the things that you do and say. As Derek Jensen, the co-founder of Deep Green Resistance, says, we keep fighting in the face of despair only when we love. For if you love, you act to defend your beloved. Of course, results matter, but they don't determine whether or not you will make that effort. That is why I began with the song Borishudhara Majhe Shanti Robari. For it says again and again, Vitoro Vitoro Prem Pashano Hridaye. In the end, how much you love is all that will matter. in this new age of precarity. Thank you.
Thank you for this brilliant talk on uh, this topic. Uh, so, without further delay, we will take questions if you permit. So we will take few questions. There, you can see the flood of questions coming to you. So if you permit, then you can take few questions.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
I see a question from Debobroto Adhikari. Where do you see literature studies after COVID-19? Do you think it would cease to exist, or will there be a resurfacing of humanities because of it? And the question sort of is truncated there. Is there anything after it, or will there be? Is that where the question ends? Or okay, its ability to make us think critically. Thank you, Debobroto. That is a very important question, which I wanted to address in my paper, but again, time restrictions came in. I feel that we need to understand that the humanities, particularly the environmental humanities, the energy humanities, these will have a very crucial role to play in creating narratives, narratives that will, in a sense, bring about what I was saying at the end. Bring about the affect, the love that will cause change, will build public opinion. Um, to be quite honest, we've all been reading facts and figures about global warming and climate change, but in that list of what really in your daily life really moves you, climate change doesn't feature in most people's list of what affects them seriously at the emotional level. But writing, particularly creative writing, and importantly, the kind of creative non-fiction, fictocriticism, critical writing that deals empathetically and sensitively with um, the precariat and both the economic and ecological consequences of this post-pandemic world. um, I think that will help to create affect, that will help to generate affect, without which really no kind of change is possible at all. So the humanities certainly are very well equipped to do that, to create affect in a way that no other discipline can do. If you look at the kind of writing that Donna Haraway, for example, has been doing, you get a sense of how creative writing as well as writing about the lives of people, of animals, of non-human agents can come together in a brilliant kind of way. Thank you for that question. That is a very important question. But I would like to also put in that perhaps the humanities have shied away from engaging with other disciplines, particularly economics, urban studies, human ecology, and a greater degree of interdisciplinarity is needed if the humanities needs to make itself relevant as an academic field in the coming world. I see a question from Rita Pradhan. COVID-19 is like a big challenge in terms of every important aspect of our life. Do you agree with it, madam? Of course, I agree with it, Rita. There is no aspect of our life that really has not been touched by the pandemic. But remember that, there has been a pandemic in the early 20th century as well. We had the Spanish flu, killing billions, and the world survived that. We had two major world wars in the 20th century, and the world survived that. And largely it was because people, in a sense, put their heads together and figured out ways to survive. So even as I'm speaking about this growing precariat, into which, in fact, many of our students might eventually, fall, into the category of the precariat. I think that the idea of improvisation, this idea of using one's individual resources, family resources, collective organizing, all of these, will help, those who have been pushed into precarity to survive. Humans are capable of enormous, innovation, and as I said in my paper, a lot of economists, political thinkers are actually viewing this emergence of global precarity as a positive thing, as something that might actually bring about revolutionary change. Vishnu Nambudri writes, literature as resistance, literature as channel of change, literature as a true social reflection. Where's the rest of the question? Are we moving into the age of post theory? I don't think that, I find that the word post is unnecessarily, sort of, I think it's done to death, because a lot of the things that we have learned from, post colonialism, post-modernism will come in very handy in our response to the world of digital surveillance that we are finding in the new world order, the Belt and Road and String of Pearls world order. A lot of those will come in handy, as will older, theories of anti-colonialism, structuralism, a lot of theories which we dismiss as, things that have been transcended by, post theories, are actually going to come in very handy now. So I suggest that we keep our theoretical toolbox open, have at hand, all of the theoretical weapons for analysis that have helped to analyze earlier worlds in crisis, earlier countries and regions in crisis, because I think those tools will come in handy again. Yeah. Sritoma Roy writes, how can different countries join in a collaborative attempt amidst this growing xenophobia? That's a very good question, Sritoma. We find that, a lot of right-wing governments around the world are actually using the kind of confusion, confinement into which populations have been pushed because of the pandemic to implement extremely illiberal and intolerant policies. So, for example, in Europe, we have countries actually recriminalizing queer identities. We have, for example, in Brazil, again, another right-wing led country, the gradual stripping away of the rights of indigenous or tribal peoples. So, there already across the world, the precariat, as I said, emerged from the 80s, but you already had the informal sector, beginning to be visible, and theorized about from the 60s and 70s. So, in a sense, you might say that movements have already started happening. We've had global solidarities against the WTO, the World Trade Organization summits. We've had global movements in which farmers in different parts of the world have come together to organize against Monsanto, for example, and other exploitative corporations. So these are already happening. It's just that we need to allow time for people who are now entering into the ranks of the precariat to try and see, now that the older forms of political theorizing seem the sort of the old parliamentary left, for example, in India, don't seem to be really functioning well. What might be alternative ways of mobilization? And these could range, in diversity from, as I said, Gandhianism to anarchism, to a whole range of radicalisms around the world. Given that the internet exists, you will see these movements linking up with each other, as other people's protests movements have done in the recent past, in the last few decades. So that is going to happen, whether or not you and I predict it.
It's a
Rupayan,
very long question.
yes, Rupayan is a familiar face. Ma'am, do you think that the precarity of the migrant worker has been the truth of reformative democracy, only rendered visible by the pathological crisis of the nation state, meaning the COVID-19 crisis? Do you feel that this state of precarity of the laborer has been born as an effect of the pandemic? If the former is true, um, why was the media and other sovereign agencies, including the intelligentsia, oblivious of the migrant labor's crisis in the heydays? What's the rest of the question?
So he has not posted the rest of the questions.
All right, so let me just respond to the first parts. Of course, the migrant worker, in my paper, I talked about how the informal, unorganized sector has been steadily growing. In fact, I would argue that the vast majority of India's labor force is in the unorganized, informal sector, has always been. And trade unions and unionized labor, formal organized labor, has actually been a very small percentage of the labor force. So that's always been, in a sense, as you say, the perennial truth within Indian democracy. And I think what I said at the end about the lack of sensitivity of most people, the fact that issues such as the fate of the precariat, the fate of the ecology, these don't really feature affectively in most people's list of daily priorities, and which is why the middle class, or the upper middle classes, who in a sense control the national print and electronic media, they've never really focused on these lives before. It's only now, with the pandemic and migrant workers protesting, demanding that they too have the rights to live, to return to their homes like everybody else, um, because that directly affects, as it were, the state of well-being of cities in which the middle classes live, the state of large towns and cities, that disrupts, in a sense, the complacency of the urban space. That suddenly, the media, print and electronic, has begun to take note. Um, you are well aware that reporting on the working classes and rural reporting has always been the weakest aspect of journalism in India. It's only organizations such as those of P. Sainath that have been documenting quietly but efficiently the lives of migrant workers and the lives of this disenfranchised.
So, okay, Dee, as I don't find any more questions here. So, yes, Rupayan has posted the rest of the question. Heydays of lockdown, the last portions
Okay.
in the heydays of lockdown. Yes.
Yeah. So if just the last 3 words, but I think I've addressed the question. Niladri,
Yes,
I see.
Niladri, yes, yes.
Well, thank you for asking. I knew that love would be that which you know uh, I think connects both of us in terms of our concerns about what is happening to the world today. What is it that stops? Can we have the question again? It seems to disappear. Yeah. What is it that stops us from seeing love, affect that informs so much critical theory? I think that you're right. Why do we insist on evacuating theory of emotion? While the kind of work that, say, Judith Butler has done, or many feminist theorists, queer theorists have done, has been deeply linked to, I think, the affect of love. Largely, I think that a lot of theory, particularly materialist theory, structuralist theory, has not factored in affect into the way in which economies function, the way in which individuals respond to crises. It's only, I think, in recent years, as people's protests, the protests of the proletariat, the protests of the precariat have increased. That we see, the emergence of theorizing that looks at affect, that looks at love, or the range of emotions in a sense that drive human beings. And again, I think connecting this to an earlier question, the humanities in particular, much more than I would say the social sciences, are equipped to bring to the fore this question of affect, of love. Yes, there is much theorizing that is happening now that is, in a sense, driven by love, but um, much that doesn't factor in emotion at all. And I think that in the coming years, we will move more and more towards this focus on affect, because in a world that is really now in ruin, and where what we can only do is salvage from that ruin, how we salvage and what we salvage to a large extent will be driven by affect.
Okay. So thank you. As I don't find any more questions here, but you have taken a lot of questions, and thank you for that, for entertaining each and every questions. And it's really wonderful, and it's an honor to host you. So we will end today's session with the formal vote of thanks, and that will be delivered by our students of UG of our department, Mautisha Deuri. So I would request Mautisha to give ma'am the formal vote of thanks. Mautisha.
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, it's really a pleasure to hear you again after the national seminar of our college in September last year. And it's an honor for me to convey the vote of thanks to you on behalf of the Department of English. Hence, I, Mautisha Dehuri, on behalf of our department, would like to convey my gratitude to respected Dr. Nilanjana Deb, Associate Professor of Jadavpur University, whose enlightened lecture on life without the promise of stability, reflections on the community, the state, and the planet in a post COVID-19 world, which indeed is a very relevant topic lately, has enriched us to a great extent. I'd like to thank our Honorable Principal, Dr. Gopal Chandra Bera, whose copious permission has enabled to fructify this session. I'd like to thank our HOD, Professor Tanmay Kundu sir, whose enthusiastic effort has given this online lecture series a reality and us an opportunity to stay connected with the world outside in this pandemic era. And last but not the least, I'd like to thank all the participants here for their zealous participation. Thank you once again. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dee. So we can end the session here. Yes.